firestorm right now. So, how do you handle the world? How do you navigate it? Well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss. So, welcome to the Birking Conservative. All right, John, how's your week been?
Man, busy. I think, let's see. So we got a good offer on our house, and then 30 minutes later, we also got an offer accepted for a house that we are looking to purchase. So all of this happened very, very quickly, and so all of that stress was put into about one day, as opposed to over 3 months, like any rational person would do.
Yeah.
Also, with the pandemic going on,
Yep.
and of course, the political climate that's out there, so kind of stressful, and trying to make sure that I keep my family as sane as possible.
Yeah. Well,
It's a challenge.
I'm glad we get this time to just talk through stuff that's going on. I mean, you just mentioned a whole bunch of things there, and then, like you said, life is still going on. We still have to navigate that too. So, but the first real question then is, what are you drinking tonight, and why?
So I'm on my third drink already. Kind of pre-gamed it, but still on the Bushmills
Nice.
Irish whiskey. A nice little fact about that is the Bushmills Distillery, which I visited multiple times when I was in Ireland
Yeah.
in 2010 and 2011. It is the oldest licensed whiskey distillery in the world.
Oh, really?
It was, yeah, that's right. 1780s is when they were producing Bushmill specifically. And just so you know, that Edmund Burke was born 1729.
Okay.
So he should have been able to enjoy some of that, maybe.
Yeah, he'd be proud of you for that.
This was a good century.
I've got some scotch for tonight, so I'm kind of moving in that direction towards Burke, and I think we're going to need it. Talking about all the big things that are going on. I'm also using this glass. I'll kind of show the camera. This is a glass that I got in Afghanistan. So they custom made it there, and I was able to get it from a local market before I left a few years ago. So
I remember seeing that. It's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. So I'm going to enjoy it. But we've got so much to talk about tonight, and really, what I think is we're going to do something crazy, man. Is with all of the tension that's going on, and everybody's social media is blowing up. Your Facebook feed, Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff is blowing up about what's going on. There's all these horrific images, and really, there's a lot. Like with all social media, there's a lot of judgment. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of confusion. And so, what I want to do tonight is I want to explore both perspectives because you're already seeing people start to polarize. How do you feel about the riots? How do you feel about what people are doing? And the minute that you start to speak on that, you find yourself really in one group or the other. And, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I think what would be really helpful is to kind of go down the route of looking at one perspective on that, and then let's look at the other worldview because I really don't think that happens that often. It doesn't happen as much on conservative channels, it doesn't happen on liberal channels, it doesn't happen a lot of times in the news. So let's take some time and look at that. So are you game for that?
Man, I am already game for that. I've been looking at the comments that have been on the page,
Yeah.
and I feel that when you start running that middle ground, you're going to start receiving both praise and criticism from both sides. I am down for this.
Yeah. So what I really want to do is try to do justice as best that I can to both. I mean, I don't understand everything about what's happened, and I come obviously from a particular ethnicity, and so I'm not going to try to presume that I know what someone of a different color would think. But I do want to look at the facts. I want to look at the data, and I want to look at Burke's perspective on that. So, and I think that's different. That's different. Been having some discussions on the page from people who identify themselves as conservative, and they actually, and a few recognize Edmund Burke as really the father of modern conservatism. And I was having a discussion in particular with one guy, and he was telling me that Burke would be more or less lockstep with the Republican Party and Trump today, and absolutely in their corner. And I wasn't so sure. And here's a quote that I think will help with that. So I'm going to read it to you. And Burke says, "All government, indeed every human benefit and enjoyment, every virtue and every prudent act is founded on compromise and barter. We balance inconveniences, we give and take, we remit some rights that we may enjoy others, and we choose to be happy citizens than subtle disputants. As we must give away some natural liberty to enjoy civil advantages, so we must sacrifice some civil liberties for the advantages to be derived from the communion and fellowship of a great empire. But in all fair dealings, the thing must bear some proportion to the purchase paid." None will barter away the immediate jewel of his soul. I mean, how different is that than what you get from the news normally?
Wes, I think that is pretty different. I think that just comes from Burke's view of rights itself. That these are, we talk about human rights and natural rights. For Burke, he felt all of that was inherited. You can't just grab them and say these are my rights just because I'm a human being. He would say no. If you have those rights at all. First off, that's questionable. But second, if you have them, it's because you inherited them,
Yeah,
because your father and mother worked hard, and your grandmother and your grandfather and your great great grandfather, your great great, and he would just keep continuing on and on,
yeah,
stating that everything you have, you've inherited, and as a result, you also give back.
right.
Now, if you want to connect that to what's going on right now, I know I'm jumping the gun a little bit. At the same time, you don't want to say to people that, well, obviously because you're living in this kind of society, you've got to trade that liberty of being able to, walk on the street and not get murdered just so you can live here. Like, no,
Yeah,
that there's some wrong that's going on here in this world that needs to be admitted, but with the constant correction that let's make sure that we understand that you have inherited something that's very special here in this country, and there is an expectation to pour it back. Everyone I see talking on social media that's outcrying against the protests are talking about personal responsibility, and that's where I think there is some legitimacy, to one side, where
yeah,
we need to emphasize some of that,
yeah. I
right?
mean,
And that personal responsibility, Burke will pull and say, yes, that's where you need to give back.
yeah.
That's one side, though, only one side.
Right. Well, and that's kind of what I was hinting at is this part about him supporting exchange and compromise and barter with the other side. I mean, that's so different than what you get on the typical Fox News broadcast or commentary. I mean, that's different than what you get from Donald Trump. Is there's increasingly this notion that conservatives should not tolerate anybody on the left, that we shouldn't tolerate anybody who's a moderate, we shouldn't even tolerate someone who's a conservative who doesn't line up with what we believe. And here you have the father of modern conservatism saying that all progress requires an exchange and a barter and cooperation, all this, which means that we have to take the time to listen to the other side. Doesn't mean we have to agree, but we need to listen to their worldview and work with them as opposed to just running them out of the building or off of our Facebook page or blocking everybody that says something that we don't like. I mean, how different is that than the culture we find ourselves in today?
I hear you on that, and I think that when you start looking at these protests and what they're doing, and you might question the violence, um, but
Sure.
based on this point that you're making, Wes, like who do we look to find this space where we can actually talk and have a productive conversation?
Yeah.
Do we look to Trump to do that? No. Do we look to our political news broadcasts to find proper debate going on that's respectful of both sides? No. Is it really a shock that people feel that they have to loot and set fire to things to be heard, and just to reach any point of conversation? That shouldn't be surprising at all, given what has happened.
Right.
So, what example do we have in our nation where in this point in time where people are coming to the table with completely different views, right? And yet they still respect one another for what's happening. They could totally disagree on whether or not racism is still prevalent. They can disagree on how to solve our issues on poverty or broken laws, but they can still respect one another. Do you know of any entity that is doing that, or any
Yeah.
leaders that are meeting regularly to do that? I mean, look at what happened. We just talked about the Heroes Act,
Yeah.
completely passed
Yeah.
on a partisan level by the Democrats. Is there any conversation going on about how we can reach a bipartisan measure to help people who have been affected by the virus? Like,
Yeah.
what example do we have of cooperation?
Right.
It's not there right now.
Well, and I know some of the Trump supporters on our page um, would say that we are owed that as well, right? That Donald Trump represents a particular belief system, and he stands up for many American values. And if we're going to listen to the other side, then they just need to listen to us. So that's kind of my goal tonight: is let's go through both sides and let's try as best we can to listen and learn and to do justice, both the side that is absolutely infuriated by what happened in Minneapolis, and then the side that's infuriated even more so by what's happening to the cities and shops and innocent people around the country. So the first question that I asked this week on our page was about systemic racism. Does that exist in America? And man, that blew up. I'm going to look at it on my phone here, but we had dozens and dozens of comments and reactions to that across several different posts. And what struck me about those posts was how people were absolutely convinced one way or the other. And there was a couple posts on there where people were asking us to define, well, what do you mean by systemic racism? What do you mean by that? We've got to agree on definitions first. And I think that's absolutely
Yeah.
important because when people are saying yes, it does exist, maybe they're thinking of something different than someone who is saying no, it doesn't. So here's a definition that I pulled from a think tank, and it talks about systemic racism existing on every level of society, and I think it's talking about American society. And I'm going to throw out some of these facts and figures from Brookings at you, and I'm looking forward to getting your reaction. So I'll go through these quickly. This says that black graduates are 2 times more likely to be unemployed. It talks about the wealth gap, and it says the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a black family. It says black Americans are 30% more likely to be pulled over, that more than 60% of people in prison are people of color, and 5 in 10 black children live in poverty. And finally, black women are 4 times more likely to die during childbirth. So, what do you make of that? Does that prove to you that systemic racism exists, or how would you see it based upon some of those facts? Because let's explore this worldview for a second.
Well, first, I can make those figures worse for you. We were being pretty mild with that. You can add capital punishment on there that blacks are more likely to be killed. You can have blacks are more likely to drop out. Blacks are more likely to die from COVID-19.
Yeah,
The statistics are everywhere on that. So that's just the tip of the iceberg there, Wes.
it is.
I think that if you want to try and define systematic racism by saying that it's found inherently like within written laws, I think that's going to be really hard to prove. It certainly was there before, but I think that despite you overhauling laws and adjusting laws to promote equality, you can change every HR rule book in every institution, and you will still find racism.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the laws, but like you said, within every level of society, you can still encounter it. So I think that certainly you can't deny that we've had systemic racism before in our past, and that casts a long shadow, Wes, that we have not gotten out of. So if it may not be, we may not wear it on our sleeve as a nation, but it is certainly still there in the spirit, and it's a terrible, more like a demon. It's a terrible demon that's still with us. So is it really surprising in the sense that you can find that in our law enforcement? It shouldn't be. It's been going on for decades and decades. Wes, it's just that recently we've attached cameras everywhere, or everyone has smartphones. So it's just that we're just now capturing what's been going on for decades. To be honest, if there was no cameras on what was going on with George Floyd, it could easily be just disregarded as, oh, he was resisting arrest, their boss. So that's why we had to do what we had to do. Oh, okay. Well, then go on business as usual.
Yeah.
You can't do that now. There's cameras. So I think that it's still there on a immoral level, but maybe not on a legislative level as much as it used to be.
So a couple of things. So I don't think that people actually on any side would disagree with these figures, right, that I just put up, and I'll put them up again, the things that I read off to you, and the other ones that you mentioned. I don't think that people disagree on this. What they look at is, are the laws in our country specifically creating this situation, especially when compared to the past, right? So they're measuring history and they're saying, well, it used to be so much worse with slavery. It used to be worse with segregation, and now we don't have it quite as bad, and yet we still have these things, the fact that those laws are gone. But then I was looking at several studies that show how the effects of decades, centuries of racism doesn't just evaporate overnight, and specifically talking about the educational gap that's created, the worldview that's different. And then kind of what you were talking about is not so much the laws itself, but how they're executed, right? So let's say that there was a person who's a racist, and then they find themselves in a position of power. Is it going to be prevented if they're actually pursuing their beliefs? And how long are they going to be able to operate before they're caught, right? So maybe it's not so much in terms of how the laws are written today, but more how they're executed by certain people who fall through the system, or how things are happening outside of the legal structure that can still be common enough to be systemic. What do you think about that?
I think that's true. I think that you need to look beyond just what is written. I'm sure that the officers, if you examine their playbooks, if you examine their HR rule books, you examine that that the officers' facilities and everything that educated them, you probably won't find any sort of written instruction that somehow promotes racism. But these people are people, right? They had their own mentors, they had their own training, and either their racist sentiments were not caught, which might be a failure of the system, and they were allowed to pass. Maybe they were provoked and encouraged by camaraderie or by upbringing. But I think that that is where things are broken here, is in the relationships that we have. We might not have the legislation to promote racism here, and that provokes familiarity with everyone, with all
Yeah,
people groups, but that doesn't provoke understanding. And I think that's the problem here that we have with our ethnic relations, is that
yeah,
we might know someone who is different, but I don't understand them. I don't understand their story. They're not real to me like my story is real to me. And compounded upon, if I was a different person with different family, with different friends, with different training, with different mentors, I may not see these people as people at all because I don't care about their stories. And in fact, my story puts my race, my ethnicity above them. Maybe I've been hurt by them in the past, and therefore I need to hurt them back. Like, it's the stories that we tell ourselves in our own familial units,
yeah,
and our own relationships, that affect, I think, these sentiments. And on that, is there a systemic problem with the stories that we tell each other and with this lack of familiarity with the other? I think so.
yeah.
And I think that's where this is coming
But
from.
I guess my last thought on this, and then we can move on, is when you look at these facts and figures, when you look at the incarceration rate for the black community, you look at the wealth gap. Is it ultimately, is it because the people there are not following the American dream or the rules or laws over them, or is it that that system that's in place in America is actually targeting them inappropriately or pointedly against other ethnic groups? Right. That to me is the number one question. And like in terms of how you see it, do you see the system coming after you, right? Or is it that you don't see the system as working for you and something that can benefit you, and therefore is not worth your time?
It's a difficult question, Wes, because you're asking, is does the problem lie with the people as a group, or does the problem lie with the institutions that we've created,
Yeah.
and are they flawed? Yeah, I mean,
Tough,
like a
right?
Drew Birkin, you might say it's a mix of both. I think that, or I can answer even, with the story here. So a few years ago, I was over at VCU campus. There was a protest. It was a Black Lives Matter protest, and you had everyone come out there. It was very peaceful. It was a clear demonstration of what they were for. And you had someone come up there. It was an African American, and she said, "Hey everyone, I'm glad you are out here." And they were very,
Yeah.
very passionate. It was filling up the entire campus. She said, "Who here wants to make a difference?" And everyone was like, "Yes." And she said, "Do
Yeah.
you want to make a difference here beyond this protest?" And they said, "Yes." And then she said, "I need volunteers to come to my school and invest in the lives of my second graders, because if we do not have people who come in and invest in the lives of these kids, their parents aren't going to do it, their friends aren't going to do it. I'm overworked as a teacher already. I need people who will make a difference that goes beyond one day."
Yeah.
And I think, and that made a calm over everyone, because it all of a sudden it made them realize that this goes beyond just, oh, I've been hurt and the institutions are flawed and we need justice. And it goes beyond just, oh, well, it's a people group that's damaged and we need these institutions to correct them.
Yeah.
I think it's a mix of both, where we need both support for a group that has been targeted, that has been suffering under centuries and centuries of racism, and they still suffer from it. This group needs to, and I'm not saying they need support just from people who are well off or more privileged. I think there needs to be, again, a whole huge support system of conversation and dialogue that is not happening right now,
Yeah,
even just down to a mentorship level.
yeah,
Okay, and then at the same time, these institutions that we have need to be corrected when they step out of line. Which I'm glad to say these officers, of course, were fired, and you've got one being prosecuted. So that needs to happen, and these need that's irregular for that to happen, until now.
yeah.
So there needs to be accountability on both sides.
I love that, man. I love that. It's that's exactly it. Instead of looking at this from all or nothing, you're seeing both action for both sides of this to take. So let's look at some Burke. Let's look at Edmund Burke, the person that we named our channel after, and let's look at what he had to say. So I pulled up some quotes here. Um, so he talked about, first of all, let's look at what he thought about America. So I'm bringing up this quote. He was talking about British taxation. So the Stamp Act and all the stuff that led to the Boston Tea Party. He was looking at how his country was taxing America to death. They were raising these taxes not because they needed revenue, not because they were hurting, but simply to spite America and try to subdue them. He's like, this is so wrong. He's like, this is absolutely not what we should be doing. We should be friends with America. We should not be persecuting these people. They're innocent. They haven't done anything wrong. And he's sitting there in front of his colleagues in Parliament, and he says this: people crushed by laws have no hope but to evade power. If the laws are their enemies, they will be enemies to the law. And those who have most to hope and nothing to lose will always be dangerous. Okay, so I shared this on the page a couple weeks ago, and you could look at this quote in a lot of different parallels today. You could look at this as like COVID-19 response. If the government is out to get you, which conservatives understand, then you need to be able to protest against it. You need to be able to say, hey, these COVID-19 restrictions make no sense in my community because we don't have hardly any cases, and yet you're shutting everything down, right? If we don't live in New York City or Miami or Seattle, we live out in the country. We haven't had a lot of cases. We have hospital beds. What are we doing sitting at home, especially if we're low risk? And so the laws are not my friend. They're killing my business. They're making me upset. They're endangering my livelihood. And now I'm going to take action against them. I'm going to protest, as Americans did, right, against some of these restrictions in many states. So there's that piece of it. But then think of it from the perspective we were just talking about. If you believe there's this systemic racism, if you've experienced it multiple times, then you see this system is out to get you. And that's what's fascinating to me, is that many right-wingers understand the notion that government can be a problem and out to get you, but then do we find it hard to believe that a black man is nervous when he gets pulled over, right? Like there's that same distrust of the government institution. And so you see here Burke empathizing with that. So that's one of them. And then there's another part of what Edmund Burke stood for that a lot of people don't really know, and a lot of historians kind of gloss over, right? Is that he was absolutely against colonialization. And that's a pretty awesome thing, is that Burke wanted his country that had all of this power back in the 18th century to help the world, to support other people, to go and expand its influence, but in such a way that people could rise up, they could develop themselves, and they could become allies with Great Britain, not conquered by them, not their slaves, not colonized, but actually grow together. So he had that type of view. And then he runs into these people like the East India Trading Company that are absolutely horrific, that are subduing natives, that are calling them savages, enslaving them, making them work for no pay, that type of thing. And this is what he had to say. As he said, I'm going to pull up this quote here. He said, "Providence is not asleep. The wrath of heaven will sooner or later fall upon a nation that suffers with impunity its rulers thus to oppress the weak and innocent." And I think about the weak and innocent, John, that are being affected by what's going on, right? I think about how many people in our country who are not out there, creating violence or vandalism. I think about the people that are just going about their day, whether they're black or white, and how they're being affected buy this. Or I think about the people that, are driving down the street and they get pulled over and now they're scared to death because they don't know what that cop's going to do. Right? And so
Right.
here you see Burke, who, lived in a time where, frankly, a lot of people were okay with colonizing. They were okay with slavery. It was a very common practice back then, and he was taking these type of stances against that even then. So when someone says, you know what, he would never spend any time or have any empathy for what's going on, in the black community, I have to disagree, John. I have to disagree because look at these quotes. Look at what he was saying about the people who were suffering from systemic racism in his day. And if to any
Mm.
degree what we've talked about is true, if the left has any validity at all when it recognizes this stuff, then we have to think that he would at least give it the time of day. He would at least feel necessary to talk about it and maybe to some extent empathize it and not dismiss it entirely. So,
I don't think that he would dismiss it at
yeah,
all. I think that what you have is something where more and more people are getting hurt. I think that, like you said before, Burke relishes the institutions. He
yeah,
relishes society and its traditions. So when you see small businesses getting destroyed during a time when they're already being pushed to their limits, I think that's devastating for an economy. That's devastating for a city. I think you're going to be losing out on more jobs. You're going to be losing out on more money for the city, and it's
right,
just going to damage people overall, which I know Burke would lament. And yet, at the same time, peaceful protests have happened before, like I've mentioned, and nothing's come from it. We still have another couple of years, and then someone else gets killed wrongfully by law enforcement. Are things going to change unless people actually make a stronger statement? I can't say for sure. I think that if all you had was peaceful protests instead of all of this rioting, would it have gotten as much coverage? I mean, you are seeing on social media that some people are talking more about a business that was looted
yeah,
than they're talking about being devastated that someone was killed wrongfully, that did not need to be
right,
at all, did not need to be at all. And so, to what degree do we actually value one human life? One human life should be
yeah,
too many for all this. And yet, what we're talking about is businesses, which are still people's livelihoods. So it's complicated in that regard. But what I do want to bring to attention, and I think Burke would also recognize this, is this is a moment, this is history in the making. Okay, this will be a moment in history, um, decades from now. And for some people, Wes, this is a political marker for them. I mean, it's
yeah,
a young generation who is mainly participating in the protests. And you've had people who became strong movers and shakers, and they got their start by protesting. And I think that, I'm trying to think of just different markers in our lives that got us into what we're into now. Like, what brought you into the Air Force?
yeah,
I know that 9/11 was a significant marker for both of us, Wes, in our political development and in our views, to motivate us to actually realize that there is a world out there that we are out of outside of our control. We are being affected, and we need to start jumping into what policies are being made and what decisions are being made, and develop some of our own viewpoints for ourselves, so hopefully that we can make a difference.
yeah.
And I think that and while we shouldn't write off all of law enforcement just because of a select few, we can't write off all of the protesters because of a few people. There, just because someone's wearing a law enforcement uniform does not mean that they are going to murder anybody they see who's committing forgery. And just because we see someone out there who's protesting does not mean they're about to loot a target. There needs to be some discernment about what these people are doing and what they're standing for.
Yeah.
But I think something needs to be said that this is, for some of these people, they're going to be movers and shakers in the next decade, and they're going to have gotten their start and realize that the world is bigger due to these incidents that
Yeah.
are going on, COVID-19, as well as the death of George Floyd. So we don't need to write that off.
Well, okay, so then you get to the other side. That's really where I was heading. Was you get to the right wing side that says, okay, we empathize with what happened to him. We empathize with,
Mhm.
you know, the fact that these particular cops, did this to him. We empathize with the struggles of the black community. But at what point is it too far? How much, should a person be allowed to destroy as they protest? And you have these stories coming out now of protesters just going absolutely nuts to the point that they are vandalizing black-owned businesses. Now you have like black owners like, what did I do? I'm not part of the problem that you're coming after me. You have people who aren't even native to the particular city that are coming in and inspiring these protests. You have paid protesters who were just doing this for the money, not because of the cause. So you have this corruption within the movement, and then you get to a point where Burke actually is helpful on the other side because he is also famous for calling out the French revolutionaries who were equally nuts and killing all of these people. And he said, look, their revolution is, maybe it was justified to some extent in the beginning, but as they became increasingly violent, he lost any type of sympathy for them, and he started calling them out, and that's his most famous work. And so I bring that quote to you as well. And I put this image out of this burning car and the burning building behind it from these protests, and that's where you have Burke's most famous work, is he says, "But what is liberty without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils, for it is folly, vice, and madness without tuition or restraint." So there is the complexity, the duality of Edmund Burke right there, is that he is someone who fought against slavery. He fought against systemic racism with the East India Trading Company. He fought against it and said this was wrong. But he never got to the point where he said, and it's okay to burn down your city. It's okay to destroy everybody's livelihood in the process of fighting it. He never got to a point where he said, you know what you should do? Become an armed, angry, hateful revolutionary who destroys everybody in the process. And he brings that balance back, right? And so you're asking, well, where is that line drawn? And I think you can find that with Burke, is that he says this is it, is when you have liberty without any sense of wisdom or without any sense of virtue, then you've gone way, way too far. So what do you make of that?
I think, Wes, that what's needed right here is, and I think what Burke would probably say is that we have a marker of destruction. We have a marker of hurt, an open wound that we have never really truly addressed. We need a marker that can be there for healing. What marker
Yeah.
can we establish?
Yeah.
Right now, I would say Burke would be pretty skeptical of people who are reacting very radically. I think for Burke, it was always about the end game. Where did the American Revolution, where did he think that would actually go?
Yeah.
That was, again, a movement of movers and shakers and thinkers and debaters. They didn't all agree, but they knew how to have a civil discourse and create something extremely special out of the whole ordeal, out of the violence.
Yeah.
With the French Revolution, it was a bunch of people who were out for blood, and that was it, plain and simple, for whatever abstract purpose they could think of. And here, what do people who are protesting want? Right.
Yeah.
What can actually be given that would bring the violence to an end? Because I would think that Burke would want the violence to end. He would not say, yep, keep on going until equality is there. No, equality, what is that?
Yeah.
That's an abstract notion that who knows when we're going to ever actually achieve that ideal. What can happen that can actually bring these protests to an end? Obviously, I don't know that answer, but can you imagine, Wes, just for an instant, what if President Trump, right, was to call up Barack Obama and say, can you come to the table with me? Let's get the cameras here and let me apologize to you for some of the things I've said to you. I don't agree with you for an instant. I don't agree about any of your policies. I think that you made things rough for me, but I want to show the American people that I can sit down and have a civil discourse with someone who is not my skin color and say, I need to ask some forgiveness from you about the things that I said to you,
Yeah.
because that was not right. And if Barack Obama was to agree and say the exact same thing to Trump, can you imagine what kind of political marker that would be?
Yeah, and at
in
the
midst
same
of all the
time, have
protests?
Obama call out some of these protesters and say, "Hey, some of you guys are going too far." So when you get to the point where you're destroying, people's livelihoods who had nothing to do with the problem, right? You've gone too far, and start to create some boundaries for this. I totally agree. And so that's a great way to talk about like the distinctions of Burke in modern times, what you would expect from your leaders, because he made those distinctions between the French Revolution. You guys have lost it. You are way too violent. You're killing everybody, including innocent people in your wake, versus the American Revolution, where it's like, look at these people. They are actually fighting for a cause. We're the ones that are, antagonizing them, and they're just trying to defend themselves and enjoy their God-given rights. So he provides that distinction, and I love the idea, of an Obama-Trump meeting to be able to discuss this, and I totally agree. I wish that would happen. I found another quote, and that we can kind of end on this one, and it's from Booker T. Washington, and I loved it. I shared this, and I think this probably got more likes and
Yes.
shares than anything that I've put out in the past month. And I'll read it to you. And it's Booker T. Washington saying, "I will permit no man to narrow and degrade my soul by making me hate him." Man, I love that the dignity of what he's saying there is you can fight for people's rights, you can call out injustice, you can take to the streets, but when it gets to the point of hate, which I think it's pretty clear what that looks like, that's when you start to
Hmm.
lose the cause that you're fighting for. And when we see
Hmm.
people that are trying to make a statement and they're saying, "Hey, we need to get the cameras looking at us," that's one thing. When you get to the point where it's infused or grounded in hate, then you're actually doing a disservice to your own cause. And I mean, you look at his generation and what they stood up against and the stands that he took and how much he accomplished, and and many of the people that came after him. And I mean, that's just an incredible example, I think, for what's going on. So,
I agree, and that's the only way you'll ever find a true ending to where we can move forward. If your end game is just destruction and hate, do we really think that will promote a more equal society? Whether or not you believe systemic racism is there, do you think that will promote more equal society? What would rather do it? Listen to bring understanding. If you want attention, you've got it.
yeah,
You've got the national attention already there. Do we need more nights of protest? Do we need more destruction? Or is there a way to start re-entering into the system to overturn it with the stories that you tell, which
sure,
is ev- obviously more people than just George Floyd was affected by this, right?
yeah,
More people than George Floyd was killed by law enforcement. These stories need to be heard in a very civil manner, knowing that it takes the other side to promote equality,
yeah,
right?
and I,
It's not
yeah,
won just by conquering and by hating and destruction. It's won through sharing
yeah,
and debating and understanding one another.
yep.
So that's where this is going. Is this going to go forward with that kind of end game? And right now, I don't see that. I don't see
I
that, and
don't,
the leaders
yeah.
aren't forthcoming with
I
that.
don't know, but I know that I'm going back to that quote about Burke talking about every human benefit and every virtue being founded on compromise and barter and listening to other people and recognizing
Mhm.
that you have to give things up. And that's the attitude that I'm going to take into this, John. Is like I want to learn and I want to listen and don't want to presume the other side and I want them to feel valued. And I may not agree with some of the tactics that someone takes, but I'm going to do my best to understand why, and I'm going to try to find that middle ground that Burke talked about. And I think that is true conservatism. It's not just advancing your own agenda; it's doing what Burke says, which is trying to work towards that peaceful solution. And someone might do some things that shock me or that anger me, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to discount their right to live, to have those opinions, to take those actions necessarily. I'm going to try to find that common ground and try to ascertain a place that we can get to that makes changes that they want to see without forfeiting everything that we have to avoid that type of violent French Revolution and to pursue the American one that is built on principles. So I love it, man. Thanks for
Let's
the
be on.
discussion. Yep, go ahead. If you've got any last comments, go ahead and throw them down.
Yeah, just the last comment here. I mean, let's be honest. If you want to be a Burkean conservative, you risk being misunderstood the most.
Yeah,
It's
tell me
easy
about
to be, I
it.
think, a hard right. It's easy to be hard left and just say, this is where I'm at. Already in the comments, we had people saying, wow, you are as liberal as they come. You are in no way a conservative. And only because you wanted to hear what the other side has to say. It's fascinating. But if you want to know more, if you're interested in Burkean
Yeah.
conservatism and a little bit more of what we stand for, I encourage you to tune in every Sunday night. Hit subscribe on YouTube, Twitter, so you can receive notifications. Share your email with us if you'd like to know more. But it is a risky venture, but it is an amazing venture and well worth it.
All right. Thanks, John. Have a good night. I appreciate all your time.
Take care, Wes.
All right.